Hello, I'm Dieter, and I'm here to talk to you about my home country, Belgium. Belgium is a small country bordering the Netherlands, France, Luxembourg, and Germany, and it also shares the North Sea with the UK. Belgium is a very flat country with the hilly Ardennes in the southeast. Belgian weather is mild and often rainy. It is divided into two major linguistic regions, with the Dutch-speaking Flanders in the north and the French-speaking Wallonia in the south, and a minor German region in the east. The capital city is called Brussels and hosts the headquarters of NATO and the European Union. Political power in Belgium is shared and divided between a federal authority, 3 language communities, and 3 regions. There's about 17 political parties they vote for, who can build a majority with other parties. And there's also a king. It's super complicated, and even most Belgians don't really understand how it works. As a result, Belgium has a reputation of being an absurd country. One of its most famous landmarks is a peeing boy, and one of its celebrities a singing nun. So how did Belgium, with its bizarre borders that run through houses, and infamously ugly houses, become so surreal? Let's find out. Belgium is sometimes nicknamed the battlefield of Europe, due to the many wars that have been fought over this tiny piece of land. It's been conquered by most major European powers, starting with the Romans. The first time the region was in fact distinguished as separate from our Germanic neighbors was when Caesar famously called the Belgae the bravest of all tribes, because of how difficult it was to conquer them under the leadership of Ambiorix, whom we now consider our first folk hero. By the way, the Romans, they would often treat their aching muscles and wounds from the battles in hot mineral spring waters in the Belgian village of Spa, which is where the word spa comes from. Much later, during the medieval ages and the Renaissance, the former tribes became small scattered feudal states. Of these states, the most wealthy became known as Flanders and Brabant. They were both centers of trade, fertile land, and fine cloth. The appearance of wealthy monasteries led to manuscripts and beer, the latter of which would become a huge part of our living cultural heritage. They commissioned a lot of religious arts to teach the illiterate people back then about Catholicism, patroning Flemish masters like Van Eyck, Breugel, Van Dyck, and Rubens. It was also home to many famous composers at the time, like Orlando de Lassus and Ockeghem, whose Franco-Flemish style influenced music styles all over Europe. Mercator developed a new world projection, which would end up becoming the new standard for map makers worldwide. For centuries, the Low Countries were at the forefront of some of the most famous fine art movements in the West. All this wealth, culture, and progress came at a cost, however. The states in the region became the subject of endless wars and disputes between the Franks, Burgundy, Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, and this guy. Upon Napoleon's defeat in 1815 in Waterloo, in southern Belgium, major European powers finally decided that enough is enough for creating a buffer state to stop all these countries from constantly fighting each other. They Frankensteined together a chunk of France together with the Netherlands, despite them having completely different cultures, religions, languages. So, no surprise, the South hated their new king, resulting in the Belgian Revolution that started in an opera in Brussels 15 years later. After a lot of rioting and protests, European powers finally decided to meet the people's demands, and in 1831, the country Belgium was officially born and assigned its very own king. In the aftermath of the revolution, the young country had its work cut out for it. They had to compete against its neighboring former rulers. It took many major political advancements and a huge infrastructural expansion for the country to overcome its most difficult years. With the building of the first railway connection on the European continent, and becoming the second most industrial powerhouse in Europe, Belgium was the very first country on the mainland to experience the Industrial Revolution. It was Belgians who introduced the world to the Solvay process, the first synthetic rubber, and plastic. During this period, the French-speaking barons in Wallonia owned all the coal mines and textile industries, whereas in the Flanders region, it was mostly farmers and laborers. This expanded Wallonian wealth made way for several new developments, one of these being a new architectural movement called Art Nouveau by Victor Horta. The movement aspired to return to nature with decorative plant-like curves, using the convenience of modern materials like iron and glass and ceramic. Around the same period, the saxophone was also invented by Adolphe Sax, a Belgian. Regardless, the growing inequality irrevocably deepened the divide between the two language communities. Socialism was born after Karl Marx witnessed this class divide and wrote his Communist Manifesto in Brussels. Shifting gears for a second, despite often being a victim of war, Belgium also has its own dark pages in the history books. Most notably in the Congo. Our king, Leopold II, personally owned colonies in the Congo, where he forced locals into slave labor to work on his rubber plantations. He stole their resources to fund the building of many lavish monuments, earning him the nickname the Builder King. In 23 years, it is estimated up to 13 million people lost their lives as a result of the exploitative regime. The countless international reports of the king's cruelty forced him into giving up his colonial ambitions and relinquish control over to the Belgian government, 1 year before his death. 50 years later, when Congo fought back and achieved decolonization, the Belgian government and monarchy worked closely with the American CIA to make sure the independence movement happened with as much conflict and chaos as possible, assassinating several important Congolese key figures. Our government is on better terms with the Congolese nowadays, due to acknowledging and admitting regret for the atrocities, as well as repatriating many pieces of important Congolese art. When the World Wars hit, Belgium initially took a neutral stance in both. Still, the Germans invaded Belgium twice. The occupied country suffered greatly as a result, and many of the bloody battles were fought on Flanders fields. This is the reason why our national flower, the poppy, is the international symbol for remembrance and hope for a peaceful future. As a reimbursement for the damages during World War I, Belgium claimed its current German region. At the time, my hometown, Antwerp, with its second biggest harbor in Europe, was critical for Allied supplies and millions of refugees coming from all corners of Europe who just wanted to find a better life in America. This melting pot of cultures, paired with liberation by American soldiers singing ragtime tunes from home, inspired Belgian jazz, with names like Django Reinhardt, Todd Tillemans, and Jacques Brel becoming jazz legends. After World War II, our government began its shift away from colonialism towards diplomacy. The mindset of Western Europe at the time was excitement for the future and faith in the science which would lead us there. Earlier during the war, a Belgian priest came up with the Big Bang Theory. In the 50s, we hosted the World Expo, which we built Atomium, a landmark celebrating scientific progress. Shortly after, a Belgian invented the contraceptive pill. Many scientists and priests who stayed in the Congo ended up actually doing valuable research, developing vaccines, and creating an institute leading the world in understanding tropical diseases. At the same time, the wealth distribution completely flipped on its head. The coal mines in Wallonia, those closed down, and Flanders became rich from investing in modern technology. Belgium had to completely rediscover its own sense of national identity. As such, the country began to advertise its bountiful local cuisine, like the aforementioned beer, but also waffles, pralines, genevers, speculaas, mussels, stoofvlees, and most importantly, French fries, which every Belgian will obsessively explain to you were invented in Belgium and not France. Sports, and especially football, became super popular, finding some common ground, but the country never truly formed a strong sense of unity. In order to cope with their inferiority complex towards the strong nationalism of other countries, they instead developed something called Belgitude, a sort of national identity of self-mockery, For example, remember how I mentioned earlier how Ambiorix was our first folk hero? He never knew what Belgium was, nor did Charlemagne, Godfrey of Bouillon, or the man who invented roller skates. Yet still, we proudly call them Belgians as a joke towards the nature of nationalism itself. This self-deprecating folk humor inspired many artists of the time. René Magritte became one of the founders of Surrealism. His witty images challenged our preconditioned perception of reality. Belgian symbolism gave us Knopf, Spiliart and Maeterlinck to bathe us in dark, dreamlike spaces. Pop artist Panamarenko gained international fame with his impossible flying machines. And finally, there was the rise of the Franco-Belgian comic book industry. Spirou, Tintin and the Smurfs became household names for children all across the world. My hometown Antwerp became known as a capital of both fashion, with the so-called Antwerp Six, and the historical diamond industry. In the mid-90s, a Belgian co-invented the internet, on which famous current-day Belgian artists Stromae and Angèle now share their music. Today, Belgium is one of the most peaceful countries in the world, with an advanced high-income economy and great standards of living, healthcare, and education, made possible by having the single highest tax burden in the world. Yet, despite all this, the most famous Belgian to this day is still Hercule Poirot, who is not only fictional, but also written by an English author. Still, not bad for a country the size of Maryland.